Lightning split the sky the night I discovered the hidden camera in our bedroom. A twisted gift from my wife, Vicki, meant to feed her paranoia, but instead uncovering her own betrayal. As the storm raged outside, the footage revealed her deceit with my best friend, turning my grief into a roaring inferno of vengeance. This is no ordinary tale of infidelity. It's a journey into the darkest corners of trust and betrayal, where every shadow hides a secret and every smile masks a lie. It's another Friday evening. I got home late, but my wife, Victoria, came even later. I wasn't happy she went out with her friends after work, but everyone needs some time apart from their spouse. Vicki is thoughtful, always telling me when she's leaving, where she's going, and making sure she gets home early. She usually arrives by 8 in the evening. This afternoon, while I was in a work meeting, I got a text from Vicki saying, "The four of us are having a drink. I'll be home late, my love." Vicki rarely goes out, maybe once every 3 to 4 weeks, so why does it bother me so much? Well, that's another story. In short, I have trust issues, not just with women, but with anyone who spends time in bars with friends without their spouse, or travels often for business. Vicki does both, but her traveling is the hardest for me. You might wonder why I have these problems and how they relate to Waikiki. Let me tell you a short, sad story. I grew up in a bar. My parents owned the most popular bar in our small town outside St. Louis, Missouri. They also ran a fancy French restaurant next door. People came from all over to eat and then danced the night away in the bar. I saw it all, and my parents taught me to be careful. When I turned 16, they decided I needed to learn the business. My older brother and sister had started working there when they were 16, too. By the time I started, my brother was 21, had a degree in hotel and restaurant management, and was running the bar. My sister was almost 19 and starting college. At my age, I wasn't allowed to work in the bar, so I waited tables in the restaurant. I hated it because, like most teenagers, I wanted to hang out with friends and have fun. I wanted an easy job with lots of money, preferably where I could flirt with pretty girls. After 3 weeks at the restaurant, I started to change my mind. I saw so many attractive women that I thought I was going blind. My parents often had to send me back to work when I got distracted by the bar. One night, my sister, who was also working, came up to me and said, "Donnie, get back to work and ignore everything you see or you'll get in trouble." I turned to her and said, "But this is Mrs. Horton, and she's out with a man. She isn't wearing underwear. Do you think Mr. Horton knows? I can't wait to tell the guys." Sarah looked scared and muttered, "Oh no." Just then, I felt my father's large hand on my shoulder. He said, "Don, come with me right now." He walked through the dining room to his office, and I followed, scared. That evening, I knew I was in for a serious talk with my dad. In his office, he told me to close the door and sit down. I thought, oh no, this is going to be really bad. I sat down, feeling nervous. Finally, he spoke. "Don, I should have talked to you about this before you started working here. Mrs. Horton is a beautiful woman, isn't she?" I was shocked and nodded. My dad leaned on the table, his fingers intertwined, and sighed. "Son, this business is our life. It supports our family, pays for our home and pool, and will send you and your sister to college. It will take care of us for years, unless we mess it up. Don, if someone you know comes here with their family, you smile and greet them by name. You can talk to them while working if they want, but remember one important thing. In this business, you need selective hearing and vision. Working in the food and bar industry requires discretion. You don't see what you shouldn't see. If someone comes here with someone of the opposite sex who isn't family, you call them sir or ma'am unless they say otherwise. You don't remember they were here. You don't remember what they did or how they were dressed. If our customers do something inappropriate, we ignore it and don't talk about it outside. All staff follow these strict rules. If I ever hear a staff member gossiping about a customer, I'll fire them. I've had to fire great employees over the years because they couldn't keep quiet about clients. We're known for our discretion and the quality of our food and service. Son, you're young and I know your hormones are raging. Even at my age, I look at women like Mrs. Horton. Your mom knows I do it, and she knows you will too. But she also knows it's like window shopping. You look but never buy or try on the product. I don't expect you not to look, but I do expect you to be discreet and not make it obvious. People like Mrs. Horton always get caught. Gossip will start somewhere else and eventually reach her husband. If he's like most men, it would end their marriage. People who cheat always get careless, and eventually the spouse finds out. We don't want to start something like that. Many of them have young children, and divorce hurts the children a lot. Now get back to work and remember what I said. I went back to my job that day and worked in the restaurant off and on throughout high school and college. I never gossiped about clients, but I saw too much deception for someone my age. After I got older and started working in the bar, I watched groups of men or women at parties. I saw married people do things that would not pass the test of marital fidelity. I learned to be intolerant of people who stayed late at these parties. Many people on business trips were having fun and trying to pick up locals. It's fine if they aren't married, but many were married or wore rings indicating it. They often hooked up with our married clients. I learned to dislike them, but treated them all with politeness and discretion. At the end of the day, we wanted a successful business. I noticed those who left parties early had good, stable marriages. Those who stayed late often had difficult marriages, and many got divorced. During my freshman year of college, my father hired a new waitress. When I first saw Victoria, I was filled with lust. Working together over the next 2 years, we fell in love. We met each other's families and discovered we were kindred spirits. We laughed at the antics of the people who came into the bar. Finally, the Christmas before we graduated, I asked Vicki to marry me. By then, we knew we had the same ideas about life and would be together for life. The only hiccup was our parents' request for a prenuptial agreement. Vicki and I knew we were life partners and thought it was unnecessary. My parents had a business and a large investment holding. They wanted it protected if I inherited it. To my surprise, Vicki's parents wanted the same thing. They had a large fortune and didn't want Vicki's potential share to be shared with me if we divorced. The agreement solved these problems. We agreed that everything we owned before marriage or inherited would remain ours in the event of divorce. The agreement also covered pensions. Each of us would keep ours. The only thing we divided was property acquired after marriage. The agreement even covered childcare if we divorced with minor children. If one of us traveled more than the other, the children would stay with the parent who traveled less, unless it posed a danger to them. Graduation day finally arrived. Vicki earned her bachelor's degree in finance and landed a great job at a local brokerage firm. I received a bachelor's degree in construction management and a minor in landscape architecture. After college, I worked for a construction company for 2 years to learn the trade. Neither Vicki nor I were interested in running a restaurant or bar, so my parents turned it into a corporation and let my sister and brother run it. Mom stayed on as the accountant, and Dad was still the boss, even if it wasn't official. After working for another company for 2 years, I opened my own construction and landscaping business. My parents provided the initial capital for the business, and I received a salary to manage it. It wasn't easy at first, but Vicki steadily moved up the ranks at her job. One day she came home very happy because she was selected for a position in the brokerage company's compliance department. This department ensures that all satellite offices follow the rules of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The only downside was that her new job required some travel, about 3 or 4 days a month. This worried me because of my past experiences. Over time, my business grew. I started with small remodeling jobs and gradually moved on to building entire new buildings and landscaping them. I never tried to transfer the business out of the corporation and into my name. I just kept getting bigger salaries. The business and our income grew every year. I gradually came to terms with Vicki's travels, though I never felt completely comfortable with them. She went out with her friends about once a month and was usually home by 8 p.m. I also had to travel sometimes and would go out for a beer with my employees, but I always made sure to come home no more than an hour later than usual. After 3 years of marriage, Vicki and I decided to have children. Our first child was Patrick, and 18 months later, Suzanne was born. She was so tiny, and as she grew, she controlled me. By the time she was 4, she looked just like her mother. As Vicki gained more experience at work, she became the go-to person for handling difficult situations. She found problems and knew how to fix them. She wasn't afraid to expose wrongdoing and call headquarters if needed. Because of this, she began to travel more, sometimes for up to 2 weeks a month. We both hated it, but she was on track to take over the department in less than 2 years, which would mean no more travel and a significant salary increase. We decided to stick it out until then. Due to the economic slowdown, my company had to start taking smaller jobs that we would have passed on before the housing and stock market crashed. We laid off about half of our employees. We weren't in financial trouble because we didn't have major loans, but we weren't as profitable as before. One small job I took led my marriage down a path of destruction. I wish I had never taken that job. I walked into my office one Thursday morning wondering why I even bothered coming in. Vicki had been away all week for compliance testing and wouldn't be home until late Friday. I considered spending the day at one of our work sites to keep employees on their toes. I hadn't been at my desk long when my assistant called. She said, "Don, we have a casual environment here, and I try to treat my employees like family. Mrs. Sloan is here and wants to talk about building a deck and landscaping her backyard. Do you have time to visit her?" I thought it would be a small job, but decided to talk to her anyway. After all, a couple of days' work might help some of my men feed their families. When Mrs. Sloan walked into my office, I was shocked. She looked so much like Mrs. Horton, the first lady I was obsessed with. I could barely speak. Finally, I pulled myself together and stood up to greet her. I smiled and said, "Mrs. Sloan, I'm glad to meet you. I'm Don Patterson. Mrs. Simpson said you want to build a porch? Please take a seat while we discuss your needs. I'm not usually like this, but you remind me so much of a lady I knew when I was younger. It was as if she had just walked into the room. Please forgive me." Mrs. Sloan laughed and said, "Don, it's me, Jasmine." I guess she saw the uncertainty and confusion on my face because she continued, "You know, Jasmine Horton. Donita and Alfred Horton were my parents. We used to go to your family's restaurant all the time." "Oh my God," I said. "I'm sorry. You were much younger and have changed so much." Jasmine laughed that tinkling laugh and said, "Well, I guess we've all changed a little. I was only 10 years old when Mom and Dad got divorced. She took me in and we couldn't afford your prices anymore." After sighing, Jasmine continued, "Well, anyway, my husband and I bought a house not far from where we used to live, and he says we can build a porch and a house with a jacuzzi. I think we can do both if the prices are not too high. When I found out you had a construction business, I just had to see if you'd be interested before I contacted anyone else." We spent most of the morning talking about old times and what she and her husband Stephen had in mind. After we had a rough idea of what she wanted, I told her I would need to view the house and take measurements before I could make an offer. She said, "No problem, Don. We can go now or any time. I'm not working, so it's up to you." "I'll tell you what," I said. "Why don't I come by today around 1 o'clock in the afternoon? I need to check on my workers and get something to eat. Then I have all day to take measurements and make an estimate. Does that suit you?" Jasmine agreed, and I told my secretary, Laura, "I won't be here until the end of the day. I'm going to check out all the job sites, grab something to eat, and then go see Mrs. Sloan to evaluate her job. Just close up when you leave. If you need me, call my cell phone." Everything was going well at work, but I stayed longer than I should have to visit one of the property owners. This made me late for lunch, and I got to Sloan's around 1:30. Jasmine met me at the door, and I immediately apologized for being late. "Mrs. Sloan, I'm sorry for being late. I waited for one of the property owners. I tried to call you, but I only got an answering machine." Jasmine giggled and said, "Don, I told you, I'm Jasmine. I'm sorry I didn't hear the call. I was cleaning the pool and forgot to take my phone with me. Now that you're here, do you want something to drink or should we go look around the yard?" "I'm fine, Jasmine. Let's just go out and look around your backyard." I took all the measurements and said, "I can estimate everything except the hot tub. You really need to buy one before I can give you a price. I need to know its dimensions to order some of the materials we'll use." "Oh," Jasmine said, "I thought you would provide the hot tub too. I don't know much about them. Can't you include that in the estimate?" I laughed and said, "Yes, Jasmine, I can do that, but we don't sell them. I'll have to buy it elsewhere. To do that, I need to know what size you want. Will it be in-ground or stand-alone? Will it use 220 or 110 volts?" Jasmine looked so upset it broke my heart. I remembered how she could get upset over little things when she was younger. Finally, I said, "Let's talk about it for a while. Maybe you can call your husband or talk to him about it tonight. I can wait until you decide what kind of tub you want." Jasmine looked truly worried. She was almost shaking as she said, "Oh no, I can't call him about this. He told me to handle it, and I intend to do so. He's on a business trip in Denver, so I won't see him until this weekend. Can we just sort this out now?" I asked Jasmine more about how they would use the tub and learned that they rarely had guests. She was the one who used the pool and backyard mostly, sometimes with one or two friends. Finally, I had enough information. We went to my supplier and looked at tubs. Jasmine decided to buy a smaller tub for 5 people. I got the measurements and we went back to her house. I asked if she had a place where I could connect to the internet to access my office. Some of the items I needed for budgeting changed on Thursdays, and I wanted an accurate price list before starting the work. Jasmine smiled and said, "Of course, Don. Why don't you come into the office? Steve works from home sometimes and has a nice office set up. You can connect your laptop to our network or use our computer." I walked into the office and was amazed. It looked like a regular business office. His desk was to the left, with windows overlooking the backyard. There were 2 leather chairs in front of the desk and a bookshelf opposite. Jasmine walked behind the desk and pulled out a chair. She smiled and said, "You can sit here while you work. If you need anything, just ask." "Thank you," I said, walking to the desk. I put my laptop on the table and sat down. Jasmine handed me a DSL cable to connect to my computer. When I reached for it, I noticed a photograph and paused. I picked it up and stared at it. Jasmine looked at me in confusion as she held out the cord. "Don, is something wrong? This is my husband, my pride and joy. I've been trying to get him to replace this photo with one of his Chevelle, but he won't. I'm tired of looking at his ex-girlfriend when I use the desk." "So, what's the matter?" Jasmine asked again. I carefully replaced the photograph and moved away from the table. I looked at Jasmine and asked, "Did you tell me your husband was in Denver?" She looked surprised and said, "Yes, I said that. Why do you ask?" "My wife is in Denver and has been there all week. Jasmine, did you tell Steven you were coming to see me?" "No, Don. What difference does it make? He just told me to get an estimate for the deck and hot tub if it didn't cost more than $20,000. Why are you asking these questions?" "The woman Steve is with in this photo is my wife." Jasmine smiled and said, "Oh, it's strange that you married Steve's ex-girlfriend. We've only been married 18 months. When did you get married?" I felt my stomach churn and looked back at Jasmine. "Vicki and I have been married for 9 years. This photo was taken no more than 2 years ago because of the necklace she's wearing. I bought it for Christmas a little over 2 years ago." Jasmine stood there for a moment and said, "Don, I feel sorry for you if what I think is true. But why are you worried that she's in Denver? You said you've been married for 18 months. Do you know when this photo was taken?" "From what I remember, it was taken around the time you got married." "When did Steve frame it? Why did he say it's an old photo when he's holding a first-place trophy from a car show?" Jasmine began to cry and fell into one of the chairs. "It was 3 weeks before we got married. I just never thought. He said it was an old photo." "Jasmine, wait," I said. "Let's think this through. All we know is that Steve and Vicki are in the photo taken about 18 months to 2 years ago. Steve could be Vicki's old boyfriend because we started dating when we were 18 and both worked at my dad's restaurant. But I know the names of everyone she dated, and Steve wasn't one of them. How old is he? He's 29 and I'm 27. Well, it's possible because Vicki is not yet 31 years old. I don't know what to do. If we ask them, they might deny everything. If they're having an affair and we ask, they might become more secretive. I feel like I need to ask, but until today I trusted Vicki completely. I just don't know." We talked some more and came up with a plan. We decided to say nothing about what we discovered that day. Jasmine and I decided not to tell Steve about our conversation, and we hired a private investigator to check on Vicki and Steve. The next day, we talked to the security company we use for our construction sites, and they recommended an investigator. We spoke with their staff, signed a contract, and each wrote a check for our share of the advance. Jasmine shortened the name on her check so she could say it was a deposit for the job we were discussing. I used a business account so Vicki wouldn't see any checkbooks or receipts. 3 weeks later, Jasmine and I met with the investigator. He said, "Don, Jasmine, I'm happy to report that we didn't find anything to indicate your spouses are dating or even know each other. We watched them every afternoon and after work, and they didn't do anything suspicious. The only unusual event was last Friday when Mrs. Patterson and some co-workers went out. They visited several bars in St. Louis and danced with different men. Vicki danced with Steve once, but it was innocent. There was space between them, and neither let their hands wander. There was no kissing or anything inappropriate. No one saw them talking after the dance. I sighed with relief and leaned back in my chair. I looked at the investigator, then at Jasmine. I began to think this whole mess was due to my mistrust from working in the family business. I had checked all the phone records and even installed cameras and voice recorders in the house and Vicky's car and purse. Everything was clean. Well, I finally said, I guess we can just chalk it up to paranoia. I'm happy to know this, but I'm ashamed that I even thought Vicki and Steve would do something like that. We can stop this. Wait a minute, Jasmine said. Didn't you tell me Steve was going to San Antonio next week? Yes, she replied, puzzled. Why? Vicki told me she has a compliance check next week. I think she said it was in Austin, Texas. Depending on where they are, they could be only an hour or less apart. We've established that nothing is happening here. I think we need to check this next trip. If they come out clean, I'll admit I was paranoid. Despite the photo, it's reasonable to assume that if they were old friends, Vicki would have allowed him to take a photo with his trophy. Throughout the investigation, Jasmine and I saw no signs that Vicki or Steve were treating us differently. They acted the same as always. I couldn't see any change in Vicki from when we were dating or right after we got married. She treated me like I was the only man in the world. She was loving and attentive as ever. The Friday night before Vicki's next trip, we went out for dinner. Later in bed, I asked, "Do you remember how we worked at Dad's restaurant and laughed at all the cheaters?" I thought I felt a slight tension in Vicki's muscles, but I couldn't be sure. She smiled and said, "Yes, some of those people were really dumb. Sometimes when a coworker does something like that, I think back to those days and how stupid they were." "Why do you ask?" "Oh, a guy at work thinks his wife is cheating but hasn't found any proof. When he told me his fears, I remembered those days and told him to just relax. I said if she cheats, to keep his eyes and ears open because eventually the cheater will always be found out. The more time he takes to sort things out, the better it will be for his children. Divorce always hurts children." Vicki looked a little sad and said, "Why do you assume a marriage will end in divorce? Maybe the wife loves her husband and the affair doesn't mean anything to her. She might not want a divorce." "Oh no, he's just like me. He's used to seeing people in bars and has the same low tolerance for cheating as we do. I can't imagine him agreeing to a long-term affair like you or I might. Maybe a one-night stand, but not a fling." Vicki tensed when I said I wouldn't agree to a long-term affair, but then she smiled and turned to me. She kissed me tenderly and said, "Well, I'm glad you're still the man I married. We both know the heartache affairs can bring. If he really has problems, let's help him get back on track. Good night, sweetheart." Vicki and I settled into bed and tried to sleep, but neither of us fell asleep quickly. The next week was hard for me. I called the investigators twice, but all they said was, "Our detectives are keeping an eye on them both. We'll have a report for you next Monday." Monday finally arrived, and Jasmine and I met at the investigator's office. When we sat down, we almost felt like he had bad news. The investigator leaned back in his chair and said, "When you asked us to follow your spouses last week, I almost told you it would be a waste of money. This was one of the most difficult cheating spouse cases we have ever encountered. But you were right. Steve and Vicki are having an affair. We have photos and taped conversations to prove it. If we had only followed them here in St. Louis, we wouldn't have found out. From the recorded conversations, they meet 3 or 4 times a year in cities far away from here. Even there, they pretend to meet by chance. They try hard to look like old acquaintances. But what we found were 2 very clever cheaters. They went to 2 different cities, stayed in 2 different hotels, and met at a 3rd hotel. Even then, they didn't stay in the same room. They rented separate rooms with an adjoining door. Steve paid for his room in cash, leaving no paper trail. Vicki registered as Angela Foster with a credit card in that name and an ID from Washington, Missouri. Steve checked in as Stephen Allen, also using a government ID. They only rented the rooms from Tuesday to Thursday, staying just long enough to meet on those 2 days. I sat back in my chair and said, "Foster. Vicki's maiden name is Victoria Angela Foster. Jasmine. Isn't Allen Steve's middle name?" "Yes," Jasmine replied. "Well, I think it's all over except for the tears. I'll speak with a divorce lawyer as soon as I can." Jasmine started to say something when the investigator interrupted. "Wait, that's not all. Usually I wouldn't mention this, but something doesn't add up. I know they had sex, but it doesn't feel like a fling. It's more like they were playing a game. We have hours of taped conversations, and most are harmless. There were only 2 instances of sexual activity. Here, let me play a tape for you. When the investigator played the tape, we heard Vicki say, "You know, Steve, I'm starting to think we need to end this. We've been doing this for 6 years now and had fun. We've proven we are smart cheaters. But sex with each other isn't nearly as good as with our spouses." Something Don said Friday night bothers me. He reminded me that all cheaters get caught sooner or later. No one considers all possible options. Eventually, they become overconfident or make one small mistake. I'm still worried about Denver. It was the first time we went to the same city, and it was a mistake. We should stick to meeting in different cities close enough to meet in the middle. It's a hassle to rent 2 rooms and pay for one we don't use, but it's safer. I don't want to lose Don. I love him. The only real thrill I get now is planning and scheming. I can spend hours thinking about the deception. Getting documents, booking a room, and planning a trip is more fun than solving a crossword puzzle or Sudoku. Sex just dulls the thrill. And don't pretend otherwise. You said in Denver you always went back to your hotel unsatisfied. The investigator stopped the recorder and said, "That's not all, but this part of the conversation is the most puzzling." He stared at me as I started laughing. Finally, I pulled myself together and said, "I'm sorry, I know it's not funny, and I'm mad as hell, but there's something I need to explain." A few years ago, a couple we were friends with got divorced because the wife was cheating. She had been cheating for almost 4 years before she got caught, and it was a simple mistake that exposed her. The night we found out, we were with other friends and talked about cheating and the dumb things people do. We remembered what my dad said about cheaters always getting caught sooner or later. Vicki argued that smart cheaters could get away with it if they were careful. I disagreed, saying cheaters always slip up eventually. We stuck to our opinions, but for weeks, Vicki kept mentioning smart cheaters win. I think Vicki started her affair with Steve around that time to prove she could do it without getting caught. She might have succeeded if she had stopped sooner, but now she won't get away with it. Jasmine and I were back together, this time waiting to meet a divorce lawyer. Since sharing the investigator's cost worked well, we decided to hire a lawyer together. When we entered the office, the lawyer looked surprised. "Mr. Patterson and Mrs. Patterson?" he asked. I grinned and said, "No, sir. I'm Don Patterson, and this is Jasmine Sloan. We discovered her husband and my wife were cheating and split the investigator's bill to get proof. Now we thought we might as well split your fee." Lawyer George Spaulding smiled and gestured to the chairs. "Of course. Please sit down, and let's discuss this." I handed him a copy of the investigator's report and photographs. Before he looked at them, I said, "I don't think my case will be too difficult. I brought a list of everything Vicki and I own and how we acquired it. I also have a copy of our prenuptial agreement, which states how we will divide property and who gets custody of the children. I want a divorce due to adultery and a settlement according to the prenup. Jasmine's case might be more complicated." I gave the lawyer the documents for my divorce and sat back as he reviewed them. After finishing with mine, Jasmine handed over almost the same documents, except she didn't have a prenup. The lawyer explained the divorce process, timeline, and fees. He then discussed what Jasmine wanted from her divorce. Finally, he said, "I think I've got enough for now. I'll review everything and the investigator's report. If I have questions, I'll call. Otherwise, I'll prepare the documents. Do you want me to serve the papers or call you first?" Jasmine and I wanted a call when the documents were ready. We left the office and agreed to keep in touch. 2 days later, George called me. "Don," he said, "I looked at everything, and this is the strangest case I've ever seen. My partners agree. There was cheating, but it's obvious the woman loves you. It doesn't even look like an affair. It seems like a game, and they had to have sex to play. Are you sure you want to continue with the divorce? I mean, from everything you said, it sounds like you had an almost perfect marriage. No fights, a good sex life, and you loved and respected each other. Don, if you don't mind me saying so, it's almost like you were part of the game, too. Now your only choice is divorce? Can't you talk to Vicki and work it out?" I thought about it and finally said to George, "No, George. I asked myself the same thing, and at one point, I thought I could forgive her. If it had just been a game without sex, or just an emotional affair, I might have ignored it. Maybe Vicki was upset that I mocked her belief that she could be a smart cheater. She couldn't accept my statement that cheaters always get caught. If she hadn't crossed the line and slept with Steve, I might have been able to forget about it. But it went on for too long, 6 years. Even if the sex was lousy, it was still adultery and she has to face the consequences. George sighed and said, "Well, it's your life. I just hate doing this to you. The documents are ready. When do you want her to be notified?" I smiled and said, "Well, George, she and Steve are on the East Coast this week. She should be back late Friday afternoon. Can we notify her at work on Friday? Her plane lands at noon, so she should be in her office by 3:30 or 4. I'd like her to be served then and given the tape I have. It's a part of her conversation where she and Steve talk about breaking up. You can listen to it, but at the end, I say they lost. Like I said, cheaters always get caught." On Friday morning, I gathered my crew in my office before they headed out. I explained that Vicki and I were getting a divorce and why. I told them not to take any orders from her or share any business or personal information with her. After they left, my secretary Laura said, "Oh, Don, I'm so sorry. I just can't believe Vicki would do something like that." I remember how much she hated cheaters, some of the comments she used to make when we saw someone cheating. At 4:10 that day, my lawyer called to say the documents had been served. At 4:30, I received the phone call I had been dreading. Seeing the caller ID, I knew it was Vicki. I picked up the phone and said, "Hello, Vicki." I heard sobs, then a quiet, trembling voice said, "Don, please, can't we fix this? You know I love you with all my heart. I know I was stupid, but you made me so mad that night when you lectured me arrogantly about smart cheaters. For the first year, all we did was plan and meet just to prove we could do it. You heard me tell Steve I didn't love him and the sex wasn't even good. We were going to stop. Please don't do this to me. I can't believe you found out after all these years. How did you do it?" "Vicki, I didn't do this to us. You did. Now I have to end this. I thought we were on the same page about cheating. I thought we both agreed cheaters get what they deserve. I'm just wondering how you could even justify this. How could you do this to us?" I decided to tell Vicki how I found out. "Vicki, I never intended to tell you, but now I think I will. You were partly right when you said you shouldn't have gone to Denver together. That Thursday before you came home, Jasmine Sloan walked into my office. She wanted us to build a deck and landscape her backyard. She let me use Steve's office, and I saw a picture of you with him and the trophy his car won at the State Classic Chevrolet. She told me you were one of his old girlfriends. I almost believed it until I realized you looked too old for it to be from before we got together. Plus, you were wearing jewelry and clothes that were only about 2 years old. I was almost ready to dismiss my fears and assume you had just run into him at the car show. I changed my mind when Jasmine and I talked more, and I learned you were both in Denver that week. We decided to hire an investigator to follow you. For the next month, except for one dance at a friend's party, you and Steve had no contact. We were ready to stop investigating and write it off as a coincidence that you saw Steve and took a photo with him. But Jasmine told me Steve was going to be in San Antonio, and you said you were going to be in Austin. We decided to follow you that week. If we didn't find anything, we'd drop it. But we did find something, didn't we?" I heard sniffling in the background. Then Vicki said, "Don, I love you so much. I don't want to lose you. Can't you please forgive me just this once?" I sighed and answered, "No, honey, I can't. At least not right now. Maybe if you hadn't cheated on me, but I can't get over the fact that you had sex with him for so long." "But honey, don't you see? It wasn't really an affair. It was more like a game. I just had to prove it was possible. Sex was because we were away and horny. It was like using each other to masturbate. We didn't make love. We never told each other we loved each other. It was about playing the game and then getting some sexual relief." "Vicki, it doesn't matter. You did it. You planned to make me a cuckold and succeeded. You met Steve and planned to meet him. It probably started at one of your friend's parties, didn't it?" Vicki sighed and said, "Yes, Don. It started at a party. We were talking about a couple we saw at the bar. They were all over each other, and I made the remark about there being no smart cheaters. Steve invited me to dance, and as we danced, I told him about our conversation. Before leading me back to the table, he said, 'I bet we could beat that pattern. I travel a lot, and if I found someone who did the same, we could meet in another city and cheat without getting caught.' We danced a few more times and decided to try it. He was a manufacturer's rep, and I was doing compliance reviews. We found out we would be in the same area in 3 weeks, so we agreed to meet. We planned our non-sexual romance, agreed never to call each other at home or on our mobile phones. We used burner phones and called from work or during lunch to arrange meetings. We got fake IDs. I got a new credit card and sent the bill to a mailbox near my parents' house. We covered everything except the photo. I didn't know he still had it. Vicki smiled sadly and continued, "Like we always said, just one little mistake and the cheater gets caught. I'm so sorry, honey. I got carried away by the intrigue. I love you." I heard a click as Vicki hung up. I was surprised to feel tears running down my cheeks. I sat back in my chair and didn't notice when Laura said goodnight. My next memory was shuddering as it was dark outside. Before the final decision on the divorce, both sets of parents tried to dissuade me. The most sincere request came from her parents. One Saturday, they called and asked to visit the children. Naturally, I agreed. After some time with the kids, we sat in the lounge chairs by the pool. Vicki's mother turned to me and said, "Don, we know my daughter made a huge mistake. She was devastated when she came to our house that first night. She was hysterical and said she had ruined everything. We finally got the whole story out of her. She showed us all the evidence you had on her. Don, if I had caught her father doing what she did, I would have left him too. But can't you do what I say instead of what I would do? I know she loves you very much. I see it every time she looks at you. Every time she talks about you or sees your photo, it's her intellectual superiority that gets in the way. She always had to prove she was the smartest, and this time, it led her to try something crazy like this. Don, did you ever think you might have pushed her into it? She told me about your argument over friends just before she decided to prove she could have an affair without getting caught. I looked at my mother-in-law and said, "Yes, Mona, I thought about that. Maybe I did push her into it. I think I could have forgiven her if she had just met him and didn't have sex. But she did. You know how we both said we hated cheaters before we got married? She was adamant about the infidelity clause in the prenuptial agreement. And then she did this. I just can't leave it like this. It's breaking my heart, but I can't." The divorce was finalized, and I was glad we had a prenuptial agreement. We had some investments to split, and we owned the house together. My business, registered in the family's name, wasn't part of the settlement since my shares were considered gifts. I let Vicki withdraw her share of the house's value from the investment account, so I owned it outright. I was always polite to Vicki and never gave her trouble about visiting the children. I still wanted to hug her when I saw her, but I knew I could never trust her again. One day I was taking the kids out to dinner when Jasmine walked in. She seemed unsure of herself. The hostess approached her and asked about the number of guests. Jasmine raised one finger. I saw this and jumped up. "Jasmine, good to see you," I said. "I saw you were alone. If you want, my children and I would love for you to join us." Jasmine looked at me for a moment, then smiled. I felt my heart lighten. She quickly hugged me and kissed me on the cheek. "Thank you," she said. "I think I would like that. I've been so lonely." After Jasmine sat down, I introduced her to my children. My father walked over and said, "Don, are you hiding something? Who is this lovely lady?" I laughed, and Jasmine smiled. "Dad, this is Jasmine Sloan. Her husband was Steve, and her mother was Donita Horton. They used to come here a lot when I was a kid." Mr. Patterson smiled and said, "Oh, yes, now I remember you. You look so much like your mother. How are your parents?" Jasmine replied, "I guess they're okay. I talk to my dad on the phone sometimes. He moved to Kansas City after the divorce. I see my mom a couple of times a month. She lives north of the city. Well, I hope you have a good time tonight. Now that you remember us, come back more often." After Jasmine ordered, I asked, "How are you doing? I wish I'd called more, but summer is my busiest time. Still, I could have made time. I'm really sorry." "Don't be silly," Jasmine said. "I know you're busy, and I didn't call either. I'm here tonight to celebrate. Steve finally gave in, and my divorce was finalized today. We had to sell the house and split everything 50-50ths. He fought child support, but since he didn't want me to work, I won. I had to rent a small apartment, but once I find a job, I'll get a better place." After eating, the kids got restless. Jasmine and I talked and ordered a second bottle of wine. Finally, I said, "I think we need to go before these two hooligans get us banned from this place. It was great talking to you again. Maybe we can do this again?" Jasmine smiled and nodded. "I would like that." She called the waitress for the bill. The waitress smiled and said both bills were paid. I laughed and said, "That old man? I usually pay and he knows it. I think he's trying to set us up." I put a tip on the table, then stood up. "Come on, kids, say goodnight to your grandparents and let's go home." I helped Jasmine up and offered her my hand. "May I escort you to your chariot, my lady?" Jasmine smiled, took my hand, and said, "You may, good sir." As we waited for the kids to return, I turned to Jasmine and said, I really don't want this night to end. Before you came, I was just planning to get home in time to sit by the pool and relax. I was looking forward to spending the night alone with the kids." Jasmine looked at me and said, "Me too, except we don't have a pool at my apartment and I don't have kids." "Jasmine, it's still early. Would you like to come over after I put the kids to bed?" Jasmine smiled and nodded. She whispered, "Yes, I would really like that." After the kids went to bed, I stocked the fridge with wine, beer, and soft drinks. I set it all between the loungers by the pool and told Jasmine to help herself. I reached for a Pepsi and leaned back in my chair. Jasmine also took a Pepsi. I looked at the pool, shimmering in the dim light, sighed, and turned to Jasmine. I said, "I think your mother is partly responsible for my divorce. Oh, damn. I'm sorry, Jasmine. I shouldn't have said that. I was just wondering, Jasmine looked at me in horror, and I thought I saw a tear in her eye. I got up and sat on the edge of her chair. I wiped a tear from her eye and said, "Let me explain. I made a complete fool of myself when I was 16. I had only been working at the restaurant for about 3 weeks when your mother came in with a strange man. They had dinner and then went to the bar to drink and dance. I always thought your mother was the most beautiful woman in the world until I met you. Anyway, I couldn't take my eyes off her. My father saw me staring and heard me say I should tell my friends what I saw at school next Monday. I still remember the reprimand and lecture he gave me that evening. It shaped my thoughts on marital fidelity to this day. Later, Vicki worked with us and got the same lecture. We used to talk about our experiences and what we saw at the restaurant. I thought we agreed with my father's philosophy. Maybe I was too rigid about fidelity. Meeting your mother that night set me on a tough path. I'm sorry. And no, none of my family or our employees ratted out your mother. I don't know who did, but it was almost a year before your parents divorced. As far as I know, that was the only time she and her male friend were at the restaurant." Jasmine looked at me and said, "Well, maybe something good came out of this mess then. Or maybe not. She married that man, and they lived together until he died in a car accident a few years ago. I'm not sure, but I think she cheated on him too. They say once a cheater, always a cheater." After I was sure Jasmine had stopped crying, I returned to my chair and we started talking about other things. I learned that she had a degree in accounting and had worked in the field for some time. I smiled, remembering my mother complaining about needing more rest but being busy with the books for the bar and restaurant. A few days later, after work, I heard a knock on the front door. I opened it to find Jasmine, crying, hanging on my neck and trying to kiss me. She said through tears, "Thank you. Oh, thank you. Your parents called and offered me a job. I went for an interview and they hired me. I start tomorrow. They pay me too much." She started crying again and I just hugged her. Over the next few months, Jasmine and I grew closer. I started taking the kids out to dinner several times a week, often arranging it so Jasmine could join us. At Christmas, Jasmine was invited to dinner at the Pattersons. We both helped prepare the New Year's party at the bar, and my family joked about us being of little use because we were always hugging and kissing. By then, we were an established couple. Every invitation one of us received automatically included the other. Valentine's Day arrived. It was a busy day for the restaurant and bar, so Jasmine and I had to work. After most of the customers had left, we stayed to clean up, enjoying our time together. I walked into the restaurant and called out, "Jasmine, could you come to the bar for a minute, please? The band is on break and I need your help on stage." Jasmine smiled and said, "Sure, I could use a break anyway." When we got on stage, I asked Jasmine to hold the microphone stand while I knelt down. I tugged on its base and raised my voice, saying, "Hey, I need some light here. Can someone get it for me?" Jasmine looked around for a light source. When a spotlight illuminated us, I said, "Jasmine." The microphone picked up my voice and transmitted it throughout the hall. Jasmine looked down at me and saw me holding something out for her. It was a black square, and she thought it might be part of the microphone stand. The light was bright, making it hard to see clearly. As she reached for the object, I spoke again. "Jasmine, I'm down here on my knees begging you. Will you marry me? You brought sunshine back into my life, and now I'm only happy when I'm with you." As soon as Jasmine's fingers touched the box, she understood. She closed her hands around it and said, "What did you say?" She opened the small box and saw a beautiful ring inside. Her jaw dropped. She gasped and brought her hand to her mouth. Then she slowly took the ring out of the box, looked at me, and began to put it on her left ring finger. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she knelt down and gave me a deep, long kiss. "Yes," she moaned. "Oh, yes. I love you with all my heart. I've been dreaming for months that you would love me, too." The hall erupted with cheers and whistles. When Jasmine came up for air, she saw my whole family gathered around. My brother lifted her to her feet and hugged her. Then she was passed from person to person, each one hugging and congratulating her. Jasmine and I planned our wedding for June. Over the next few months, she slowly moved her belongings from her small apartment to my house. At the post-wedding reception, Jasmine and I opened gifts. At the very bottom of the pile was a single yellowed envelope. Inside was a heart-shaped Valentine's card that seemed as old as the envelope. The original signature was faded. Written on the Valentine were the words, "I received this Valentine from the only man I have ever loved on our first Valentine's Day. Since then, I have kept it carefully. It seems fitting to pass this on to you now. Perhaps this symbolizes the transfer of his heart from me to you. May your lives be filled with love and care for each other. May you never break another's heart or let foolish pride tear you apart. Congratulations. I wish you both a life full of love and happiness. With all my love, Victoria." Thanks for listening to One Infidelity Hit. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop us a like.